The noble enemies in Elden Ring are abundant, and you'll usually find them walking around paths in the lands between, as well as carrying items on their corpses. These nobles are also arguably probably the weakest enemies in the game. They don't hit hard or attack fast, usually die in one hit, and sometimes just cower in fear, which makes them the perfect enemy for me to base a build around. The idea is to get through the game as a group of wandering nobles. The setup can be done pretty much right away. The nobles don't have that much variety in their equipment. They have armor, one staff, and a couple weapons. The staff I can get right away by choosing the prisoner class at the start. Then once I reach Limgrave, I farm the nobles for a little bit to get their armor and one of their weapons. It actually took me about 2 hours of farming to get everything. I'm pretty sure the only spell that the noble sorcerers use is Glintstone Pebble, so I went and picked that up as well. Once I had the gear I was going to use, I needed to go pick up 2 more things, which both can be obtained from the Stormfoot Catacombs. They are the 2 Spirit Ashes, the Wandering Nobles and the Noble Sorcerer. In order to beat the game as a group of nobles, I'm going to need some nobles around me. After gathering everything, I of course went to fight Morgott. This build doesn't make this fight much different. At this point, I'm basically just using early game equipment like you normally would be using. The summons did help get the heat off me a couple times, but other than that, it was a normal fight. I ran past everything in Stormveil Castle and went straight to Godric. There's another fight where being low level and having low level gear isn't much of an issue just because it's an early game boss. I spent most of the time in the first phase up close to him along with my summons. At this point, the sword was brand new, or it may have been +1, and it was barely doing any damage. After I got my easy hits on the second phase, I switched to using some magic while I had one more summon alive. Once my last summon went down, I chipped away at the rest of Godric's health. After Godric, I took care of a couple more bosses. One of the bosses I fought actually let my summon shine for a bit. After doing enough damage to the crystal enemies, their poise basically becomes non-existent, so even though my summons have super weak attacks, they can stun lock them. Then I use the item he drops to buy more smithing stones to upgrade my staff and sword. Red Wolf of Radagon was next on the list. Unlike the last boss that I fought, the summons were not good for this fight. The wolf moves around way too much, so none of the nobles here can really get a hit on him. The fight pretty much ended up being me just trying to spam the weapon art for this sword. It's nice that the wolf doesn't really have much health, so when I was able to get one of those hits in, it did a decent amount of damage. Then it's straight to Renalla right after fighting the Red Wolf. Whenever I have a build that uses a weapon, there's no reason to really talk about this first phase. It's pretty much the same thing every single time. It was at this point while fighting Renalla that I realized I wanted to add something else to this run to make it a little bit harder. It doesn't really feel like me and the noble gang are getting through these bosses if at the end of each boss they're all dead and I'm left alone. So one other stipulation that I added was needing to have at least one of the summons alive once I beat the boss. This changes when and how I kind of use my summons, pretty much opting to summon them towards the end of the boss fight just so I can make sure that at least one of them stays alive. After the Wandering Nobles helped me beat Renalla, I went and grabbed the Dectus Medallions and went straight to Altus Plateau. I picked up some Glove Warts, that way I could upgrade my summons. It was about time for them to get stronger, especially because the next boss on the list was Draconic Tree Sentinel. I died quite a few times to this one. Now, Draconic Tree Sentinel has a lot of attacks that hit a wide area, especially in his second phase, so I was going to have to whittle him down quite a bit before I felt it was comfortable to bring in my summons. Once I got his health down low enough, I finally brought my summons in, but instantly halved their health because I accidentally used them as a shield. They ended up helping me out a little bit, and some of them did manage to survive to the end. Once that was taken care of, I ran past everything in the capital and went straight to Godfrey. I experimented with summoning the nobles right away just to gauge how long they last. I tried to keep some distance and use spells when he was slowly walking towards me. At one point, he ended up forgetting about me and started attacking my summon, so I needed to pull his aggro real quick. He was about half of his health when he ended up taking out all but one of my summons. And this last noble must have been built different because he avoided several of Godfrey's attacks. Somehow this last noble was able to survive all the way up till the end, so I felt it was only right to give him the final blow. I just stayed in this corner for a while, rolling for my life, waiting for him to hit him with his torch. Morgott wasn't too bad of a fight. It just took some patience and switching between a little bit of melee and a little bit of the spell casting. Whenever he would summon his light swords, I switched to magic. And I had a decent amount of time during this fight just kind of backing up away from him and using magic. I had the defense of a Pringle chip, so I didn't want to take too much damage up close. Once I felt he was low enough, I summoned the gang in. I whittled him down a bit more, but let the boys take care of the rest of his health. Once that was done, it was time to take the gang to the longest fight in the game. For the most part, there was nothing special about this fight. It was your normal brace break of the leg, and then continue attacking the leg for the half of his health. Again, there's not much of a threat for this first half of the fight. It just takes a while to actually chunk his health down. The staggers here and there were nice though. Sometimes he would use his ground fire move while I was picking his feet, but I was still able to get some damage in by getting to a safe spot and using my spells. For the second phase of the fight, I switched off my sword as being my main source of damage and decided to use the spells against his giant eye in his chest. The glintstone pebble wouldn't always hit his eye, but after several of them landing, I could cause another stagger. I summoned the nobles towards the end of the boss's health again. I actually did try to get the last hit here, but my last spell missed and then I ran out of FP. Luckily, Torch Noble's always here to clutch up. Godskin Duo sucked again, of course, but it didn't take me as long as some other runs. I did, of course, have another choke right at the end where he had just a pixel of health left. Even after I died, my summon nobles tried their damnedest to finish them off, but couldn't quite cut it. For the fight, I pretty much just focused on the big one, and for the first half of his health, I only used my sword. I wanted to make sure I had enough FP later on in the fight where I could resort to just keeping my distance and using spells. Once the big one was half health, I took advantage of his rolling attack and got on top of one of the pillars and just used my spells against him at this point. I still try to get in a few melee hits where I felt comfortable just to conserve on some FP. Once the big one got low enough, I made sure I was in a comfortable spot where I could finish him off because I wanted to get those extra hits in that still count as damage as he's dying. I did not want to deal with the small one at all during this fight, so I only did damage to him when he was summoning the big one back. I knew if I did it like this, the small one would not switch to his second phase at any meaningful part of the fight. Once the big one was back, I focused on him again, pretty much doing the same exact thing I did before, but being a little bit more liberal with the amount of spells that I use. Again, I get in some extra damage off the big one's death, and then only attack the small one as he's bringing back the big guy. Once I felt they were low enough, I brought in the nobles. I chipped away at their health a little bit more with some spells, but I let the nobles finish them off. I then made sure I went back and upgraded my weapons before the next fight. Next on the list was Maliketh, and honestly the first half of this fight is pretty boring. I just waited for him to attack, and I responded with a tiny glitstone pebble, and then I rinsed and repeated that same exact thing for the entirety of his first half. Once we got into the second half, though, things got a little bit more interesting, and I switched to my sword instead. The flurry slash move is my favorite to counter on because it's really easy for me to dodge. I didn't wait for him to do just that move, though. I was able to get in hits on some of his other attacks. The summons come in towards the end, and I do a little bit more damage with my sword here until I can just leave the rest to my nobles. I just sit back and watch them go to work. I stopped by Commander O'Neill to add one more thing to my repertoire. Some of the nobles that walk around in the groups carry large banners, almost like rallying standards. I wouldn't use the standard as an actual weapon, but just use the skill on it to buff my summons. After killing O'Neill and adding it to my equipment, I go ahead and take on Godfrey. I learned while fighting Godfrey that I'm going to have to wait some time before I summon my nobles in. His area of effect attacks that affect the whole arena make it hard for my summons to do anything, and if I summon them too early, they're not going to survive long. For Godfrey's first phase, I emphasize using my melee weapon. The only time I really switched to using a spell was when he did his Earth Shatter move. I try to pressure him as much as possible so that way I could cause a stance break. Once he transitioned into his second phase, I then switched my playstyle to be more cautious and use a lot more spells. I still had a lot of excess FP at this point, but made sure to save enough to summon my nobles. I waited till he did his large Earth Shatter move to give me a safe amount of time to summon. I buffed my nobles with the rallying standard, but must have instinctively tried to start attacking again and accidentally threw a spell at Godfrey. I wanted one of my nobles to get the last hit, but they were already taking a lot of damage at this point. The noble gang was at the home stretch. The Radagon portion of this fight certainly wasn't bad, but it took a little bit to get through, so I left a portion of this fight uncut to kind of show the flow of the fight. I only had the opportunity to get in about 2 of my pokes in between dodging his attacks. I also didn't get a stance break until about half his health. Finish Radagon off with my skill and prep for Elden Beast so I could immediately run to his backside and start poking. This is really all this fight was. It was just a lot of little pokes over and over. At no point in this fight did I ever get a stance break. Instead, we just have a bunch of weak little needle pokes for about 5 minutes. Do some more poking here just to get him ready for the summons. Now, I might not be the nicest to my summons because I accidentally spawned them into a nuke here. I get Elden Beast down to Torch Noble health and then go over to my summons to buff them with the Rallying Standard. Now, I really wanted my summons to finish this fight for me, but after trying to get them close to Elden Beast, they pretty much lost all their health and I was left with one, so I ended up just finishing the job myself. And with that, the nobles take back the lands between. Thanks for watching.